Hey guys, welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Today's video features a Titan build that I specifically have made for endgame content, and when I tell you that this is one of the best Titan builds currently possible in the game, I mean it. Not only does this build have access to some of the best healing in the entire game in the form of Restoration ×2, but can also boast a 99% damage resist while playing solo. For me, this is one of my favorite builds on Titan, and it's easily one of the most powerful in the entire game. Before we get into it, be sure to like and subscribe for more Destiny 2 content like this, and let me know down in the comments what you thought of the build and any recommendations you have for future videos. Thank you so much for the continued support, I greatly appreciate it. Getting right into the subclass then, for your abilities, I'm personally going with Towering Barricade. You can use Rally Barricade if you want to for the lower cooldown, either generally works. For your grenade, I'm personally going with Shackle Grenade just because suspending effects are one of the best effects in PvE, and the Shackle Grenade is a great way to just simply have that on demand. In addition, it also synergizes really well with how the Stronghold's playstyle actually works, allowing you to suspend any enemies that might prove troublesome with you in your sword playstyle, such as an Unstoppable Champion, Overload Champions, Barrier Champions, Hive Guardians. Basically any target that isn't a boss, using your grenade and your barricade will just simply eliminate them for a brief period of time because while they're suspended, they just can't do anything. For aspects, the first one we're using is Drencher's Lash, and this just allows your barricade to shoot out a suspending blast whenever you cast it, and again, this blast can suspend anything outside of a boss. For the other aspect, I'm personally using Fletched Storm. You can use Into the Fray if you want to, it's just personal preference at this point. I'm personally using Fletched Storm though because our standard Frenzied Blade melee isn't the best for endgame content, and with Fletched Storm, it allows us to have a multi-hit ranged melee option instead that can also unravel targets that it hits. Like I mentioned though, if you want to, you can use Into the Fray. Both also grant you 2 fragment slots, so you won't be missing out on any additional effects. Finally, onto the fragments, the first one we have is Thread of Generation, which just grants us grenade energy anytime we deal damage, and this is damage from any source, so whether that's our super, our abilities, gun damage, whatever, it'll generate us grenade energy over time, significantly reducing the cooldown of shackle grenades. The next one we have is Thread of Warding, and simply picking up an Orb of Power will grant you Woven Mail. Woven Mail is a 60% damage resist that lasts for 10 seconds, and this can stack with other forms of damage resist like tier 10 resilience or resistance mods, and is a great survivability tool for endgame content. The next one is Thread of Continuity, and this will just simply increase the duration of suspending effects, unraveling effects, and severing effects, which we can take advantage of all 3 with this build. And then finally we have Thread of Mind, which anytime we defeat a suspended target, it'll grant us a little bit of class ability energy, helping us with our barricade regen, which again, keep in mind, our barricade can also suspend enemies, meaning that we have a lot of options for just applying strand effects through our grenade and barricade that already have some natural intrinsic regen, as well as enhancing the effects they provide us. Before we go into the armor mods, I briefly want to mention that this build doesn't require any seasonal mods. However, there are some mods we can take advantage of during Season of the Deep, and here are the ones I would recommend. For the first mod I'd recommend, we're going to be using Improved Unraveling. This will simply just increase the amount of damage that Unraveling deals to a target over time, just a nice booster perk for the Unraveling effect. We're going to be combining this with Strand Soldier, which anytime we gain Woven Mail, our Strand weapons get Unraveling rounds, which can apply the Unraveling effect, which again is increased by Improved Unraveling. We're also pairing this with Deeper Origins and Overcharged Armory. These will both buff weapons with the origin traits Unsated Hunger, which are this season's weapons, Nanotech Tracer Rockets, which are the Neamuno weapons, Harmonic Resonance, which are the Root of Nightmares raid weapons, and Noble Deeds, which are the previous season's craftable weapons. Deeper Origins will simply improve their basic effect, and Overcharged Armory will always make them overcharged whenever that modifier is active, meaning that they'll have a constant 25% damage boost in endgame content. For other mods, I would personally go with Counter Charge, just simply granting you a stack of armor charge whenever you stun a champion, and based on what weapons you use, you can easily counter all 3 champion types with this build. And I'm also using Squad Goals, which for us, anytime that we perform a finisher while we have Woven Mail, any nearby targets also are granted Woven Mail for a short period of time. Getting into our exotic armor and our armor mods, for our helmet, the first mods we're using are Heavy Ammo Finder. We're using 2 stacks just to simply benefit our sword as much as possible, as this entire build revolves around using your sword and trying to keep up as much ammo as you can to survive in endgame content. And then finally, we're also using a Siphon mod that pairs with whatever sword we end up choosing. I'm going to be recommending 4 swords at the end of the video, and based on whatever sword you pick, you want to have an accompanying siphoning mod that allows it to periodically gen Orbs of Power on final blows. Next up onto our gauntlets, and our exotic for today is Stronghold. Stronghold got a rework at the start of Season of the Deep. In short, it maxes out the guard stats on equipped swords, and you take reduced damage while blocking with any sword, and rapidly damaging targets after blocking shots with any sword will grant you Restoration ×2 for a few seconds. It does mention that Restoration should only be gained after you block damage with a sword. However, I have found that simply damaging an enemy with a sword, even if you're not blocking initially, will grant you Restoration, and even hitting an enemy with 0 sword ammo will also still grant you that Restoration effect. Focusing on the damage resistance though, which is the main selling point of Stronghold, by blocking with any sword, you have a base 90% damage resistance coming from just your sword block, and this will also stack with things like Woven Mail and tier 10 Resilience, for example, and when you're blocking with an aggressive frame sword, that base damage resistance goes to 95%. This damage resist alone makes it one of the best survivability focus exotics for Titan, as since it also maxes out your guard stats and you take reduced damage from blocking with a sword, means that you can basically infinitely block with a sword, which keeps up high 90% damage resist at a minimum, while also having access to restoration effects. I'll get into the exact damage resist values later on in the video, so let's focus back on the mods real quick. The first one we're using is Font of Focus, and this will bring our tier 7 discipline to tier 10, granting us additional 30 stat points to our discipline stat. This is just simply to increase the regen for our grenade. On top of this, we're using Focusing Strike and Solar Dexterity. Focusing Strike allows us to have class ability energy generated for us whenever we deal damage with our melee attack, and keep in mind, with Fletchlet Storm, our melee is a multi-hit range melee, meaning that it's very easy to get additional barricade energy back just by dealing damage, and also by dealing damage with our melee projectiles, we're generating grenade energy thanks to our intrinsic grenade regen. I'm also using Solar Dexterity just to boost the sword swap and stow speed based on whatever heavy sword you pick. Again, if you want to use a different one other than Solar, go ahead and swap that out for the accompanying mod. For our chest piece, I'm rocking 3 resists that are all dependent on what activity you're doing. Reserve mods won't work with swords, and as a result, there's really no point to using them. On top of this, there really isn't anything else that truly benefits Titans specifically when using strongholds. Font of Endurance could be useful in case you don't already have tier 10 Resilience, but if you're playing on Titan, you really already should. And Emergency Reinforcement can technically benefit us with an additional 10% damage resist, but whenever you're already able to go over 99% damage resistance while playing solo, an additional 10% is literally negligible. It will result in basically no perceivable difference in your gameplay with or without it, and 10% on top of that already drastically high damage resist isn't going to mean life or death in certain activities or with certain interactions. If something is going to just flat out kill you at 99%, Emergency Reinforcement is not going to save you. So because of that, I personally recommend using 3 damage resistance mods that are focused on whatever activity you're doing. For example, the surge for the GMs this week is arc resistance, so I'm just rocking 3 of them, and at 3 damage resist mods, it'll grant us an additional 35% damage resistance from that specific source. Onto our boots, the first mod we're using is Solar Scavenger, and this will allow us to pick up more ammo whenever we get a heavy brick. Again, swap this out, fitting whatever sword you end up going with. And I'm also using surge mods that again accompany the same sword. If you want to use a Void or Strand sword that I recommend at the end, swap these out accordingly. With 2 surge mods though, we get a 16% damage boost in our solar damage, which is specifically benefiting our sword and our energy weapon I chose to pair with this build. If you wanted to boost your survivability even further though, you could also pair this with something like Recuperation, granting you an additional chunk of health every time you pick up an Orb of Power, which again can be generated just by getting kills with our sword, as well as something like Better Already, which your health immediately begins to regenerate anytime you pick up an Orb of Power. Finally, onto our mark. The first mod is Time Dilation, simply increasing the duration of the surge and font of focus effects from 10 seconds to 15 seconds. We also have Powerful Attraction, which anytime we cast our barricade, it'll automatically pick up any nearby orbs of power. And since we're casting our barricade a lot already to stagger champions and just basically stop anything outside of a mini boss, this is a great quality of life boost to this build. And we're pairing it with Reaper because after we cast our barricade, our next weapon blow will generate an orb of power guaranteed. Before we get into the weapons today, I briefly want to go over the damage resist values that are possible with this build and showcase just why this build is so potent in endgame content. Simply utilizing strongholds with literally any sword and stacking our tier 10 resilience on top of that will grant us a damage resistance at a base of 93%, and this is something we can take much further than this. However, if we chose to use an aggressive frame sword, the damage resist with strongholds goes from 90% to 95%, and stacking on top our basic resilience of tier 10, it grants us a 96.5% damage resistance. On top of this, we can also stack on Woven Mail, which is a 60% damage resist, bringing it to a total of 98.6% damage resistance, and by utilizing 3 damage resistance mods, we can have up to 99.1% damage resistance. We can even include Severing, which we can intrinsically apply with our subclass, meaning that we can have a total of 99.4% damage resistance playing solo with this build. Even if you didn't want to use an aggressive frame sword and you want to use something like Lament, for example, which is another sword I recommend with this build, you'll still have a base 98.2% damage resistance with 3 resist mods, tier 10 resilience, and Woven Mail. And again, Woven Mail is the only thing that really needs any kind of upkeep with this build. Everything else is just automatically applied to you. So yes, while playing solo with this build, you can have 99.4% damage resistance in certain instances, as well as having Restoration ×2 basically active whenever you want it, and as a result, you have one of the best endgame Titan builds in the entire game. Moving on to the weapons that actually make this build possible, and starting off with my favorite sword for this build, which is Throne Cleaver. Throne Cleaver is a craftable aggressive frame sword. If you have the previous Void version of this sword, you can also use that instead. However, this is craftable and earnable through the war table in the helm, I personally went with Enhanced Surrounded and Enhanced Energy Transfer, and I'll get into why that is in a second. But the main reason, again, that we're using an aggressive frame sword is because with it, we get a 95% base damage resistance while blocking with strongholds. In addition, being an aggressive frame sword allows this sword to put out a lot of damage in a very short amount of time. The perks I chose to pair with it are Tempered Edge, just granting us a little bit more ammo without sacrificing too much damage. Don't worry about the guard stat because, again, Stronghold already maxes out all guard stats, meaning that your guard resistance, which determines the damage reduction you actually get while blocking, the guard efficiency, which is the amount of energy required to guard a certain attack, and guard endurance, which helps you maintain your guard while you're blocking with this weapon, will all be maxed out. For the other perks, I'm personally going with Enhanced Energy Transfer. The main reason behind this is every point of damage that you block with the sword will transfer about 1 to 2% more energy to your barricade. What this means is that as you're continually blocking damage with this build, you're also slowly gaining barricade energy alongside it. However, if you want to swap this out for something else based on your playstyle, you can go ahead and do so. I would highly recommend Enhanced Surrounded though, because with Enhanced Surrounded, when we're surrounded by 3 or more enemies, we get a 41.75% damage boost to our sword damage. And again, this can stack with things like boss spec and surge mods, meaning that this thing can hit for a ton of damage even in endgame content. If you're not interested in Throne Cleaver though, and don't mind the small drop in damage resistance, there are a few other swords I want to recommend. The first is the Lament, which has been a staple in sword builds for a very long time now. Not only does it have some intrinsic ammo regen with powered kills, but it also has revved consumption, which is simply damaging a combatant with this sword will also heal you. And again, this healing effect works perfectly in tandem with restoration times 2. Alongside its other exotic effects, this also has anti-barrier capabilities, which means that this thing absolutely shreds barrier champions. On top of this, while you deal damage with the revved special attacks, it not only increases their raw damage, but also increases your damage resistance while attacking with a heavy attack. This means that Lament is a perfect choice to pair with Strongholds because not only can the sword intrinsically heal us, but it can also increase its own damage intrinsically and also provide you with even greater damage resistance, although I don't have exact numbers on how much that is for Banshee's Wail. The other 2 swords I want to recommend are Thin Precipice, which is the craftable sword from this season, and the other half, which is the craftable sword from Dares of Eternity. The primary reason I'm recommending Thin Precipice is simply because of the artifact mods and its pairing with our Strand subclass. If you remember, not only is it being boosted by Overcharged Armory and Deeper Origins, but with our subclass, it can grant this weapon Unraveling rounds, which can also be boosted by Improved Unraveling, meaning that our Strand sword is a perfect fit for our subclass and the build for this season. As far as the perks on it go, you can really choose whatever you want. I personally went with Unrelenting and Chain Reaction just to allow us to have some additional health regen, and Chain Reaction to make the AoE effect of getting powered kills with this weapon even stronger. And again, with Unraveling rounds, this thing can also unravel targets very easily, making this an ad clear monster, and also enhance its own single target DPS in some scenarios. Again, simply using Woven Mail with the standard for this build, which is Woven Mail, tier 10 damage resilience, blocking with this sword, and having 3 resistance mods, you can already have 98.2% damage resistance with it, so don't worry about swapping off of something like Throne Cleaver to a different sword. You're still going to have a ton of damage resistance. The final sword I want to recommend is the other half, and it's my least favorite out of the 4 I am going to recommend, but it has a very unique interaction I do want to showcase. The interaction itself comes from Flash Counter with Repulsor Brace, and this essentially allows us to have a Void Overshield even when not on a Void subclass, and yes, the Void Overshield damage resistance effect can stack with all the other effects. Now, the main reason I don't recommend it is because of Flash Counter. It is only active for less than a second, meaning you have to recognize melee attack patterns from certain enemies in order to take advantage of it. It's not something you can typically just do based on reaction unless you're very, very quick at doing that. On top of that, a lot of boss stomps or ground slams aren't actual melees, even though they basically look identical to them. It's only enemies that melee you directly. Any kind of knockback from a melee is basically meaning it's a stomp, it's not a technical melee, and Flash Counter can't activate off of that. On top of this, even though it disorients an enemy and technically suppresses them, it doesn't actually have the same suppressing effect as the Void 3.0 effect, meaning that this cannot stagger overload champions. With it being said though, you can combine the Void Overshield with Woven Mail, tier 10 damage resilience, you can combine it with Severing, and 3 resistance mods, which brings it to a total of 99.4% damage resistance. This provides the exact same damage resistance that's possible with an aggressive frame sword, and again, although it's not my favorite to use, it's a unique interaction that I did want to showcase because simply having a Void Overshield while also having Woven Mail and Restoration times 2 is an incredibly powerful combination and something that's really only achievable with this build. Now, if you're using a legendary sword, there are some exotic pairings that work very well with them. The first one I want to recommend is the Navigator, which is the exotic drop from Ghosts of the Deep Dungeon. Do not worry if you don't have this, it's not necessary at all. The main reason I'm recommending it is that it's very easy to get Woven Mail and Severing with this weapon. By firing this weapon at an ally, you both get Woven Mail, and also by dealing sustained damage to a target, it will also sever that specific target, and it's currently bugged where whenever you sever a target, it also just automatically gives you Woven Mail. And so because of this, it's a very easy way to apply severing to a champion, for example, without having to waste your melee on them, and it also gives you woven mail very easily. If you're rocking this build with a fire team, I also recommend having a warlock run the cenotaph mask and the navigator as well. And by marking a champion, for example, with the navigator, not only are you going to have an increase in your damage resistance from that enemy in particular, but whenever you kill that enemy, since they marked it with cenotaph mask, it also grants you heavy ammo on drop, meaning that this is a fantastic pairing with this build if you're running it with a fire team, and even if you're running it solo, it also pairs greatly with basically any legendary sword. Plus, keep in mind that if we're using Strand Soldier and Improved Unraveling, we can grant it Unraveling rounds, and the Unraveling effects that it deals do increase damage. The final weapon I want to recommend, and honestly my go-to whenever I'm using something like Throne Cleaver, is Conditional Finality. Conditional Finality is the exotic from the Root of Nightmares raid, and it's one of my favorite currently in the game. In short, it fires 2 projectiles, one stasis, one solar, and when all the pellets in each of these shots hit, the stasis one will instantly freeze and shatter the target, and the solar one will instantly ignite them. And this combination can actually deal a ton of damage in PvE. Combining this with the suspending effects that we can achieve with our barricade and our grenade, this is an absolute monster in endgame content, and when you consider the fact that since we're running a sword build, we'll always be close enough to take advantage of paracausal pellets very easily, and we can combine its endgame utility with our own Strand endgame utility through severing, unraveling, and specifically suspending effects, meaning this is a perfect endgame fit for this build. Like I mentioned earlier, this build has access to some of the best healing in the game in the form of Restoration ×2, as well as any other intrinsic healing effects you might want to add on yourself. We also have access to over 99% damage resistance, which is some of the highest possible in the entire game, and this is something we can very easily achieve while playing solo. This build is perfectly designed for endgame content, and it's already something I've used to solo a GM this season. Like I mentioned earlier, if you're watching this at a future date, just simply swap out any artifact mods that you might want to use with this build based on what's prevalent for your season, and you can have great success with it. With that being said, thank you guys so much for watching the video. I greatly appreciate the continued support on these build guides. Let me know down in the comments what you thought of the build and any recommendations for future builds. Be sure to like and subscribe for more Test2 content like this. And again, thank you guys so much for your support. As always, thank you for watching and have a great day.